Hey guys, it's Mel. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I want to share with you my October wrap-up. I started this channel at the beginning of October, so I filmed my October to be read video as my first booktube video. So this is my first wrap-up video that kind of goes together with my first to be read video. I think I did pretty well with reading a majority of the books that were on that to be read list. I did manage to read 7 books in October though. There were a couple that weren't on the original to be read and a couple that were that I just either didn't get to or didn't finish. In my September wrap up, I did say that I hadn't quite figured out my rating system yet. I have actually made a decision about my rating system, so I will be rating these books out of 5 stars today. I also wanted to quickly talk about Halloween and October being generally a bit of a spooky reading month. I personally don't really read according to season or according to months. And anyway, October in Australia is spring. So I don't really have that feeling of wanting to read spooky. It's starting to be winter, fall, autumn books. And I didn't grow up with any kind of celebration of Halloween. I didn't really even think about it. In Australia, it's starting to become a bit of a thing, but it certainly wasn't when I was a child or a teenager. So I just never really got into it. So none of the books that I read this month had anything to do with Halloween at all. Although unintentionally, some of them were thrillers, or some of them were kind of a bit spooky. Interview with the Vampire is one of those. But yeah, that was actually entirely unintentional. So who knows? Anyway, let's get started. The first book that I read this month was The Moving Finger by Agatha Christie. It's quite short, as you can see, only 217 pages long. So it didn't take me very long. It only took me probably about 2 days to get through this book. I really enjoyed this book. I thought that it was well written. It's written from the first person perspective. So the main character, Jerry Burton, is the narrator of this book. His character is really fleshed out and well realised. Some of the other characters aren't given quite as much roundedness as Jerry is, but that kind of works with the story and the way that it's told, because it's told from Jerry's point of view. There are some people that he has more interest in and more to say about and learns more about as the book unfolds, and some people that he doesn't know as much about or isn't as interested in getting to know. So it does work from the point of view of the story. I thought that the story was well paced overall. It gets us through to the conclusion of the story in a reasonable space of time. And although Jerry gives you his impressions of the town and the people, he doesn't bog you down in overly descriptive characterizations or overly opinionated expressions of what's going on. He gives you a lot more fact than you might get in other stories that are taken from a character's point of view. I was a little bit surprised with this book though. It is in the Miss Marple series of books. I had got up to page 74 when I wrote this note in my phone to myself. About a third of the way through, where is Miss Marple? So I was a little surprised to discover that Miss Marple actually doesn't show up until very near the end of the story. I have seen a BBC production of this, and Miss Marple's in the story almost immediately from what I recall. Of course, that was a while ago, so I could be misremembering. But yeah, I was a bit surprised about that. But nonetheless, I still enjoyed it. I guess that goes to show what happens when you have particular expectations of a book, especially if your previous knowledge of the book is from a TV or movie adaptation. But yeah, I did enjoy this book. I gave it a 3.5 stars out of 5. So a good, solid, enjoyable book. The next book that I read was The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. I did read it in this giant volume, which is all of his short stories in the one volume. But it is quite short, only about 50 pages long, so I was able to read it in the one sitting. I didn't love this story. I was warned about some of the overt racism and sexism of H.P. Lovecraft, so I knew about that going in, although quite a number of people did say that The Call of Cthulhu wasn't as bad as some of his other ones. But I did note that even within this story, the racism still does manage to come through. I did make some notes about some of the racism that I noticed in the story. So, for example, he does refer to people as half-castes and make note of the fact that they don't seem particularly intelligent, while at the same time referring to someone as having Norwegian intelligence. So that just goes to show that even in a story that isn't overtly racist, still has some racist overtones. It's a very short story, so it's really quite hard to rate in the same way that I would rate other stories, but I just didn't feel like there was really all that much of a plot to the story. It's really the retellings of someone discovering some research after their father, I think, has died, and then going and having a look at this research themselves. So there's not a huge amount of setting, there's not really a huge amount of plot, and the main point of the story is a description of the elder gods, of which Cthulhu is one of them. It just wasn't really that scary. Probably partly due to the fact that this was written quite some time ago and there's been a lot of horror and thriller, both written and also made for screen since then, that has been a lot scarier. So H.P. Lovecraft has kind of dimmed quite a bit in terms of scariness. But yeah, I just didn't find it that scary, particularly the description of Cthulhu, who is supposed to be this crazy, powerful, horrendous, horrific god who makes people crazy just by looking at him, and I didn't find the description that worrisome. So I'm not really sure whether I'd recommend this story to anyone. If you do like horror and you want to have a try of H.P. Lovecraft, then certainly have a go. There's nothing in particular wrong with it. Just probably wasn't my cup of tea, to be perfectly honest. Just going to check what star rating I ended up giving it. So I ended up giving it a 2.4 out of 5 stars. So like I said, not the worst book I've ever read, but certainly not up there with the best. The next book that I read was The Pirate King by Laurie R. King, which I have managed to forget to get off my shelf, so I'll put a picture of it up here when I'm editing. This is a book in the Mary Russell series. I think it might be possibly the 9th book or something like that. I absolutely love the Mary Russell series by Laurie R. King. I love Laurie R. King's writing style. I love the way that she writes characters. I particularly love Mary Russell, who is the main character of this series. She's very intelligent, very thoughtful, very interesting character, and she's really well written. All of the books are written in the first person from Mary's point of view, so the main characterization is of Mary, but she does a really good job of writing all of the other characters from Mary's point of view and still making them well-rounded and well-realized characters. Having said that though, this particular book I only gave 4.5 stars. I realised that 4.5 stars is still a very high rating, and I did really enjoy the book for all of the reasons I just mentioned, but it wasn't my favourite Laurie R. King book, so I couldn't give it 5 stars. The plot was good and well written, but it just wasn't as interesting as the rest. In this particular book, Mary is sent undercover to work for a film crew. The film crew are making a movie which is sort of convoluted. So it is a movie about a film crew making a movie which is an adaptation of The Pirates of Penzance. Confused yet? Mary is sent undercover to investigate the accusation of arms dealing, theft, and fraud from someone within the film crew. So she needs to find out exactly what is going on and exactly who is doing it. So Sherlock kind of manipulates her into going undercover as the secretary of the producer of the film, and then the story is about her going on location to first Portugal and then Morocco. It's set in the 1930s, so there's a lot of interesting historical information and historical facts. I really enjoyed the book, even though I gave it 4.5 instead of 5 stars. Just wasn't my favourite. The next book that I read was Looking for Alaska by John Green. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars, and the note that I wrote for myself was a good, solidly enjoyable book, which it was. This book is written in 2 parts. So in the middle of the story, we have an event that happens, and the first part of the book is before that event. So every chapter starts with before. And then the second half of the book is after the event. So every chapter starts with after. I really liked the way that John Green did that. I thought it was a really good storytelling technique. I thought that it gave a really nice amount of suspense for the first part of the book. And then it wrapped up what was happening and dealt with the characters, the aftermath of the event for those characters that were left behind. I don't want to give too much away about what the event was because I don't want to spoil the story for people that might be choosing to read it. But yeah, something happens that has an effect on everyone around the event, and it's about what happens after that. It's told from the point of view of the main character, whose name I have completely forgotten. But he is a teenager and he has moved to a boarding school, which is supposed to be a really good boarding school with really great academic programs. So he's moved there and he's making friends with some of the people that also live on campus. So it's just a really good book. It's really interesting. It's well paced. It's really easy to read. It's quite short. It's young adult, which I often find quite easy to read. Like many young adult books, it does deal with quite heavy subjects, but it's done in a really interesting, well-written way. So, yeah, like I said, good, solid, enjoyable read. Definitely recommend this one. Sorry if the camera position has changed a little bit. At some point, the camera stopped recording, so there you go. The next book that I want to talk about is The Wife Between Us, and I've just forgotten who wrote that. I listened to it on audiobook, so I'll put a photo of it just here so you'll see who the author was in the photo. I am honestly not sure how I feel about this book, and I really think a big part of that was due to the narration, which I don't want to affect the story because there were parts of the story that I did enjoy. And it seems really unfair for how someone reads a story aloud to you to influence what you think of the writing of the story. So I'm just a little unsure. I did give it a star rating, which was 3 out of 5, but I feel like maybe if I physically read the book, I might change my mind about the star rating. I'm not really sure. I don't want to talk about what it was about the narration that I think that I didn't like, because then I'm critiquing someone's voice, essentially, which seems a little bit unfair. I will talk, though, about some of the aspects of the story that I liked and some of the aspects of the story that I didn't like. I listened to this over a period of about 2.5 months. I've really only just started listening to audiobooks, so I haven't quite figured out exactly how I feel about audiobooks in general, and it takes me a little while to really get into them. So I'm not sure if that partly also influenced what I thought of this story. But yeah, like I was saying, the first part of the book I was a bit iffy about. I wasn't really sure, but halfway through the book there is a twist and you realise that all the assumptions that you made about the first part of the story aren't quite true, which is something that I really liked, and it made me enjoy the next probably third of the book quite a lot more. But then there was another twist at the end that again changed some of your assumptions about the rest of the story, but this time it felt really unnecessary. It felt like it was cashing in on that original change, so I didn't really like that very much. I don't want to go too much into what the twists actually were because I don't want to spoil the story for anyone that is or wants to read the story. I'll just say that I just wasn't that impressed the second time around. I also started this book with the assumption that it was a thriller, and I didn't feel that it was as suspenseful or mysterious as I was expecting it to be. A lot of the way that the story was told also was very reminiscent of The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins, which I absolutely loved. And whenever I read a book that really makes me think of another book like that, it's very difficult for me, if I really like the first book, to then like the second book if it's not as good, which I didn't think it was, or vice versa. Really, just the similarities can alter my opinion of a book, and it's not necessarily always a good thing. So yeah, 3-star book, overall, reasonably decent book. Listened to the end of it, wanted to know what was happening. If you like those sorts of domestic thrillers, then you'll probably enjoy it. I wouldn't necessarily discourage you from reading it, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it either. The next book that I read was Eleanor Park by Rainbow Rowell. I borrowed that from the library, so again, another photo will be up here. I really, really, really loved this book. I thought it was fantastic, really enjoyable read, really well paced, really well characterized, and I just had a really great time reading it. As I mentioned in my reading vlog, which I will link down below, this was my first Rainbow Rowell book, and I definitely want to read more Rainbow Rowell. I've heard from a few different booktubers that this was probably her weaker story, so if my love of this book is anything to go by, I think that I will adore anything Rainbow Rowell writes, so I'm looking forward to picking up some more Rainbow Rowell in the not too distant future. Even though I absolutely loved the book, I did end up giving it a 4-star rating rather than a 5-star rating, because it didn't quite meet 5 stars on everything that I'm giving stars to. The two main characters, Eleanor and Park, were beautifully written. Some of the rest of the characters maybe weren't as well rounded or well fleshed out as those two main characters. But again, this book is written in the first person, and it's told from the perspective of both Eleanor and Park. So when it's told from a first person perspective, when those other characters aren't as well fleshed out, that doesn't necessarily bother me, depending obviously on why. And I felt like this was a very character-driven story, and it was very driven by the two main characters, and they were the point, and their opinions was the point, and what was happening to them was the point of the story. So you only heard about the other characters from their perspective and how it impacted them and their lives. And that was okay with me, because I felt like that was the point of the story. With characterization though, I will just say that I often find young adult fiction a little bit unbelievable in the way that characters are written, because it's usually an adult writing about a teenager, so it can sometimes be hard to make that seem really authentic. I think Rainbow Rowell did a really, really great job, but there were just a few little things that I found a little bit disbelievable. Mind you, I could just be showing my age, because maybe teenagers really do talk like that, and it's been quite a while since I was a teenager, so who knows. Like I said, I did think that it was a character-driven plot, so there wasn't a huge amount of plot, so for that I kind of had to lower a little bit of my star rating. It didn't really bother me. I still really enjoyed the book, and in fact for my enjoyment rating I gave 5 stars because I really enjoyed it. But again, maybe not so much emphasis on the plot, which was okay in this particular book. Initially when I was rating this book, I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, but now that I'm talking about it, I think I'm going to bump the rating up to 4.5 stars, because I really did enjoy it, and even though there were a few things that I noticed about it that didn't mean it was a 5-star, it was overall a really enjoyable book. So that's my final decision, 4.5 stars. And the last book that I read was Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. As I mentioned when I put this on my October to be read video, this is a book that I read many, many, many years ago, and I really enjoyed it when I read it, but I decided that I had not read it for quite a number of years, so I thought that maybe I should give it a read. It was in a pile of books that I was going to unhaul. I'm not sure whether or not to unhaul it or keep it at this stage, because I did really, really enjoy my reread of this book. I'm just going to see when it was published. It was published in 1976, so I think that some of the tropes and the way that it was written are probably kind of old school now. Interview with the Vampire is written from the perspective of a vampire telling his life story, or his vampiric undead story, to a young man who is an interviewer for an unnamed newspaper or magazine. The language in this book is really quite flowery and is actually quite similar to what you might find in someone like Thomas Hardy's writings, which from Thomas Hardy actually kind of bothered me, but in this particular story it works quite well with the characterization of the vampire. He was made into a vampire in the late 1700s, I think, and so the way that he approaches the world around him and the way that he describes the world around him fits with his age and also fits with the type of character that he is. It also works really well for describing the settings around him. So we start out in a plantation in Louisiana in the 1700s, and then we move into New Orleans in the same era. And so it describes something that we would have no understanding of in this day and age really quite well and puts you in that setting really well. So in this instance it works really well for me and I really enjoyed it for that reason. It did make it quite a bit longer going than you'd expect given the size, although I think this was probably a mass market paperback. It is 368 pages long, so like I said, doesn't look on the face of it like a really huge book, but it actually took me a little while to read. I think that was partly due to the style of writing in the book. It was quite dense and flowery, like I said. But yeah, it was something that I did really enjoy, and I was pleasantly surprised to discover that I would really enjoy it. So not really sure about unhauling it. I have to have a bit more of a think about it. So that was my October wrap-up. If you have read any of these books, I would love to know what you thought of them, so please comment below. If you're going to read any of these books, please comment and let me know which books you're going to read. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up, consider subscribing to my channel, and I'll see you next time.